Welcome to At Home with Music. I'm Leon Dean. Maybe you've heard someone say after listening to one of their favorite old songs, they don't write them like that anymore. I think there's even a song that uses that saying as its title. And usually it's someone my age that might say something like that. After all, one look at me should tell you that I'm not a young man. But the fact is that a lot of folks very rarely listen to anything that is new to them. They stick to older music and they don't really engage with modern popular songs. Songs that you might find on the playlist of a Gen Zer. Well, it's not just about nostalgia. I believe that there are deeper psychological, emotional, and even musical factors at play. And what are some of these factors? What keeps some folks from ever listening to anything new? Well, there's definitely the factor of nostalgia and emotional connection. Music is deeply tied to memory. Songs from our youth are hardwired into our emotions. These old songs remind us of specific moments, people that we loved, and they just bring back certain feelings. I remember a lot of music, obviously, from the 60s and the 70s. For example, my dad loved Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. So whenever I hear that music, it brings back a lot of pleasant memories. I originally thought that Herb Alpert was Mexican, like my dad, despite the fact that Alpert is not really a Mexican name like Ulgin. Later on, I found out that Herb Alpert is Jewish. Well, it didn't matter. It was good music, and it brought back, hearing it today, I should say, it brings back a lot of wonderful memories. And studies show that music we listen to in our teens and early 20s creates the strongest emotional impact. So, a lot of us often stick to what we loved during those years. What did I love growing up in the 60s and 70s? Well, the Beatles, Elton John, and interestingly, as a piano student, I listened to a lot of classical music because that's what I was learning to play. And so I developed a love for the music of Bach, Beethoven, and a host of other classical composers. Some folks are drawn to the musical complexity and their preference for older styles of pop music. A lot of the older pop songs had rich chord progressions, a lot of variation, and live instrumentation when they were recorded. A lot of people find this very musically satisfying. And on this channel, we analyze some of these classic pop songs. And some of them are pretty complex musically. The way they were recorded using live players, well, that's a great subject to consider. And some modern pop music is simpler, it's very repetitive perhaps. There's a lot of what you might call electronic production. And some people find this too formulaic or artificial sounding. Now, I could talk a lot more about that, but that's one of the factors that keep some folks from listening to anything new. Another factor is that you just don't like the trends of modern music. You might hear some folks my age say that, hey, today's music is too commercialized, too auto-tuned. You talk a lot about auto-tuning of vocals. It's trend-driven. It lacks the authenticity of past eras. There's this emphasis on music that's very friendly for streaming, short songs. They're designed to generate social media hits. It just doesn't feel personal or meaningful. And that's what keeps a lot of folks from listening to new stuff. It just doesn't have that same connection. Another factor is there is the comfort of the familiar. There's a psychological principle called the mere exposure effect, which suggests very simply that people tend to prefer what they're familiar with. If you grew up on the music of the 70s or 80s or the 60s like I did, then naturally you'll gravitate toward that music. I tend to gravitate towards music from the 60s, from the 70s, and even the early 80s. And I also grew up with a lot of classical music that was played in the house on those old things we used to call LPs. That was through my mother's influence. She bought me a lot of classical recordings. And of course, my piano teachers encouraged me to listen to classical music. But to put it simply, some folks don't take the time to explore new music because they already know what they love and they don't feel the need to seek out anything more. Some folks won't listen to anything new. They consider that modern pop music feels all the same. I don't pretend to completely understand this thing called the algorithm, but apparently streaming algorithms will push similar sounding music, and that makes some people feel like today's hits lack variety. And they'll say things like, hey, the classic songs I grew up with, they had more distinctive artists, distinctive styles. And every decade feels unique. In the 60s, we had Motown. In the 70s, we had disco. In the 80s, we had synth pop. In the 90s, we had grunge. Well, anyway, the question is it a bad thing to only listen to old music? Well, not necessarily. Music is very personal. I'm sure it's very personal to you, and you should enjoy what you love. However, I would encourage you to always be open to new music. This can be so rewarding. There are great modern artists out there who carry the spirit of classic popular music. They write complex songs, sometimes songs that take a while to get into your brain, but you gotta dig for them. It takes some digging to find these people. Personally, I try to listen to something unfamiliar, either something old or something new, something I've never heard, every day. And I would encourage you to do that as well. There's a lot of good music out there, especially here on YouTube. All kinds of stuff you've never heard before. And you never know when you might discover a new favorite. Now, let me hear from you. What would you say you lean towards? Do you lean towards classic pop, I should say, modern pop music? Do you like a mix of the old and new? Have you discovered anything new recently? Something new to you? And do you have any recommendations for me to listen to? Or recommendations for your fellow listeners to this channel? Basically, I want to encourage you to seek out new music and enjoy the music that you grew up with as well. If you have any questions or comments, please be sure to leave those in the comment section. I'm going to come back to this subject in another video and just talk about, is old music better than new music? Well, let me know what you think. Do you think that the music of today is better than the music of yesterday? Do you think they're about the same? What do you think? Let me know if you can in the comments, and I'll be sure to respond. If you'd like to support my work, you can go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next one.